Hi guys, it's Sarah Chernick again. So we're here talking about chapter 3 today, drug policy, and I did pages 60 to pages 66. So the book starts off about addressing the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts. This occurred from 1986 to 1988, and what it did was it increased law enforcement. So marijuana and cocaine use was increasing in the 1970s, and significant amendments occurred in the 1980s to 1970 Controlled Substances Act because of crack cocaine. So what's happening is these were leading to the increased enforcement of the laws. So marijuana and cocaine were being used, but then it was really the use of crack cocaine that became um, a significant factor in the increased law enforcement. So the 1986 law reinforced penalties for selling drugs, and it also reinstituted mandatory minimum sentences and sentences without parole. So what this did, it was in establishing an amount of drug that someone can possess that would trigger a higher trafficking penalty. So it does depend on the drug, the amount, but for cocaine, it was 500-gram cutoff. So if you have more than 500 grams, that puts you at a risk for being charged with a higher penalty than if you were to have less than 500 grams. And then for crack cocaine, it's 5 grams. And if you recall, with 5 grams, you would receive a mandatory sentence of 5 years in prison. So as you can see, the type of drug determines the cutoff, and the cutoff determines the penalty you would receive if you were caught with the drug. Okay, so the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, it was a political reaction to crack cocaine's dependence potential and its associations with violence. So as it became more common and more widely used, it started causing a lot of problems because of how easily people were becoming addicted to it, and it was increasing the rate of violence. So what the law did is it made sentences longer. It implemented mandatory minimums, and there were no parole provisions. And this all greatly contributed to the growth in the prison population over the past 20 years. So in 1988, additional amendments were included into the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts, and they were considered teeth for the federal prosecution. So some of these amendments included more restrictions on aircraft registrations. So they would require bank report on all transactions over $10,000 and any other suspicious activity. There was a restriction of firearm sales, a restriction of chemicals that can be used in drug manufacturing, and there was also a death penalty being reinforced for any drug-related murders that would occur. And so by 1988, the law toughened the penalty toward drug users, and this was done to hopefully reduce the demand of the drug in the general population. All right, so the book also goes on to talk about scheduling. So this is how they rate the drugs. So a Schedule 1 drug is a drug that's like very addictive, and that would be, well, actually marijuana is a Schedule 1 drug, and so is ecstasy. And then it goes down the line, Schedule 1, Schedule 2, Schedule 3, Schedule 4. So a 1984 law allowed Justice Department to trump Secretary of Health by immediately placing drug on a Schedule 1 for later review. So what this would do is say that this drug is illegal, there's no medical use for it, and they would go back and review it later. The DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, also had a big impact on scheduling. They had major control in determining the drug schedule level. Right? And then sentencing talks about the penalties that are given out for being caught with drugs. Sentencing guidelines developed by the U.S. Sentencing Commission, and they were based on complicated point system. There are also additional complexities provided by congressional amendments that includes a additional amendment to Homeland Security in 2005. And this was done because of the importation of methamphetamines and precursor drugs. This also included internet sales of date rape drugs in 2006. So before the Anti-Drug Act was put in place, there was few penalties for users of drugs, and there was a little interest in convicting them for small amounts, also known as microdosing. However, after the Anti-Drug Act, there is now a civil fine for being caught with the drug for $10,000. You may be forced to forfeit your car, boat, house, or anything that contains the substance. You would also have a loss of federal benefits, and that includes student loans and grants. So for your first offense, you would lose those for up to a year, and for a second offense, you would lose federal benefits for up to 5 years. Right. And then in 1988, the law removed public housing from an entire family of anyone engaging in criminal and drug-related activity on or near public housing premises. So if a mother or father is caught using drugs on or near public housing premises, that entire family would be kicked off and no longer allowed to live in that housing. All right. And then we moved on to asset forfeiture. So this is when the government can seize property if they believe it is associated with a commission of crime. So the government seizes the asset based on reasonable suspicion, and then the burden of the seizing is then put on the previous owner of the asset. So they're responsible to hire an attorney and go to court to receive their property back. Over the past 30 years, billions of dollars in property has been seized, and this has led to complaints of abuse. And some states have even changed the law so that property can only be kept if the person is convicted of the criminal offense. By 1984, the law allowed federal government to share up to 80% of the proceeds with the state and local law enforcement. So this was good because it actually encouraged the local police to cooperate in investigating suspected drug dealers because they would receive a percentage of the money. The one thing that I found interesting was that innocent until proven guilty is not incorporated in this because it's not considered a criminal charge. The textbook then goes on to talk about the Office of National Drug Control Policy. This is a law established in 1988 by the cabinet level position of Director of National Drug Control Policy. They're also known as a drug seizer. So they are given a job by the legislation to prepare national drug control strategies and annual consolidated drug control budget for federal agencies. They're responsible for advising National Security Council, and they're also responsible for reporting directly to the president. And in 1998, this was reauthorized again, and the authority increased. Okay. So designer drugs is a term that was created in 1980, and it refers to the chemicals that are closely related to controlled substances, but they're not listed on the schedule. What was happening was chemists were tweaking the structures of opioids and then selling them as synthetic heroin. So as a result, Congress passed a Controlled Substance Analog Enforcement Act in 1986. What this did was it banned any chemical or drug intended for human use that is similar to a controlled substance, even if it's not directly named on the schedule. Unfortunately, this law was overturned because it was too vague and they couldn't enforce it. Okay, so state and local regulations that were put in place, there is considerable uniformity across the states for regulating legal prescription and over-the-counter drug sales. And after 1970, Controlled Substance Acts were adopted And so what this did was, it was a model state law recommended by the DEA, and a majority of the states adopted the same 5 schedules from the federal law. So this was the Schedule 1, 2, 3, etc. However, 6 states have a different breakdown of the schedules. So they have 4 schedules, 6 schedules, 7 categories. And then 3 states have a completely different way of categorizing drugs. So they don't use schedules. There's also a difference in the penalties across states. So in some states, you could be caught for cocaine use, but depending on the state, you might go to prison for a year or less, or you could go to prison for 15 years. And then a violation of illicit drug law can also lead to either federal or state charges. I found this really interesting because if you're charged by the federal or by the fed, if you receive federal charges, sorry about that. If you receive federal charges, the minimum law is probably going to cause the sentence to be longer. So as instead of if you were charged by the state. So if you got charged for drug possession by your state, the chances of the sentence being shorter was higher than if you were to be charged federally. You had a chance of having a longer sentence. State versus medical marijuana laws. So the biggest discrepancy between state and federal laws is in the marijuana industry. 28 states allow the use of medical marijuana, with 6 of them are now allowing recreational use. But users and marijuana dispensaries are still considered violating federal law because federally, marijuana is considered a Schedule 1 drug, but state-wise, it is not. The textbook then goes on to talk about drug screening. It talks about how the different job positions and how these different positions are tested for drugs. So the military and federal employees, inexpensive screening began in about 1970s. It was used to detect abused substances or metabolites in urine. And it was started in the Navy and the Armed Forces. Those were the first 2 groups to really use the drug screening on a large scale. But later the tests also were used on high profile positions, oil workers, professional athletes, air traffic controllers, and also people at high risk for drug use. In 1986, President Reagan declared random urine screening for all federal employees in sensitive jobs, and he also urged companies and businesses with the federal government to begin testing their employees as well. So for transportation workers, they are required to receive a drug screening, and this really revolves around the 1987 collision of an Amtrak passenger train that led to about 16 deaths. So now they do surprise drug testing there. And in 1992, they expanded the testing to interstate truck drivers as well. Private employers, they may require testing before hiring new employees, and they could also periodically test throughout employment. The 2 main reasons that they adopted the drug tests is, first, they believe that a drug-free worker is less likely to be absent, will make fewer mistakes, has better safety record, and produce better results. The second reason is that by spending the small amount of money on a drug test, they're protecting their company from any negligence suits. So if a Stone employee accidentally hurts a customer, they're going to receive a negligence suit. So companies in business with the federal government are required to have a drug-free workplace. Next, the book goes on to talk about drug testing in public schools, which is something, we have all experienced if we've been in high school. And a lot of people believe that the testing of high school students is an invasion of privacy. The reason for this is that randomly testing them without any evidence of drug use might destroy any sense of trust the student has with any school officials. But the first group of students to subject to the urine screening were athletes. This was done in 1995 when the US Supreme Court said that athletes are at a higher risk for developing drug dependence, and therefore it allowed them to test athletes for drug use. In 2002, the Supreme Court also upheld the testing of other extracurricular activities, and they could do this because when you're participating in these activities, it's considered voluntary. So you must agree to a possible random drug screening when you're joining the activity. In 2003, George W. Bush endorsed the random testing of all students, and he even provided funds to help the school districts pay for the drug tests. And then in 2012, legality of random drug testing in public schools has still not been established on a federal level. The final part of the book I did pages 60 to 66. Sorry, I forgot to say that earlier. But the final part of the chapter I read talked about the different methods of testing and some of the advantages and disadvantages of each. So the first type of test is a urine test. So the advantages of this include that it is capable of detecting most kinds of drugs for up to 3 days, but this does depend on the amount of drug being used, the detection cutoff, and the amount, like how many times this person is using the drug. So if they're a normal user, the drug is going to take longer to leave their system than if they were just to smoke one time. So a higher amount is needed for the detection means the higher amount needed for detection means a shorter detection time. So what this means is that if the cutoff for a drug is higher, then the time to detect the drug in someone's system is shorter. This is because the drug's not going to stay at this level. So as the days go on, the metabolites are leaving the system. So the level in their body is going to drop below the detection level. A lower threshold for detection increases the sensitivity of the test for a longer time, but it does also increase the rate of false positive results. Marijuana metabolites can be detected in urine for 5 days or more, but for long-term users, again, it might take longer for this drug to leave their system. The disadvantage of urine testing is the problem of cheating the drug test. So sometimes people find ways to dilute their urine, to use someone else's urine, or to even take some kind of supplement or something to mask the presence of the drug in their system. So the results of the test are not always accurate. Another test is hair testing. So the advantages of this is that it's capable of detecting a drug for up to 90 days. So it has an easier time detecting drugs than any of the other procedures, and it's also less invasive. The book did not address any of the disadvantages for hair testing. For saliva, the advantages include that it is less invasive, easy to collect. However, the detection rate is lower, so you can only detect the drug for a short period of time, usually up to 1 day. So it's not exactly accurate on a long-term basis. And then the book just finished up talking about the concern for accuracy. So large workplace testing programs might split the sample that they receive so that they can test the urine and then retest it again, because they have a big concern for false positives, since there are other things that could cause false positives, including legal drugs or even some foods such as poppy seeds. And then finally, the book just addresses test kits. Tests for marijuana, opioids, amphetamines, and cocaine are usually the basic drugs that are tested, and they may also be tested along with PCP, MDMA, etc. So what the kit does is it detects the presence of a drug or its metabolite in the urine, but it can't tell you the impairment of the person at the specific time of the test. It can only tell you previous use before the test. And that's only if they have enough of the drug in their system for it to be at a level of detection. So overall, the general idea of a drug test is more of to discourage the use of illicit drugs than to actually detect the impairment of a performance of a person. So thank you for listening. The audio might be rough again, sorry about that. This is chapter 3, drug policy, pages 60 to 66. I hope you guys had a good weekend, and I'll see you next week. Thank you. Bye.